question. You mentioned global warming. I'm a big believer that we should follow the science and follow the evidence. If you look at global warming alarmists, they don't like to look at the actual facts and the data. The satellite data demonstrate that there has been no significant warming whatsoever for 17 years. Now that's a real problem for the global warming alarmists, because all of the computer models on which this whole issue was based predicted significant warming, and yet the satellite data show it ain't happening.
Where it showed that we're not warming nearly as fast as the IPCC climate models suggest we should have been warming. So the point is, a lot of evidence now is being amassed, which suggests that the climate system is simply not as sensitive to our addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere as most scientists think it is. But we're mincing words when what we should be emphasizing is we're not getting anywhere near the warming that the models have predicted. To me, that's the take-home message.
The bottom line is this: it is the same thing with climate change. And in a sense, climate change can now be considered another weapon of mass destruction, perhaps even the world's most fearsome weapon of mass destruction.
What I would suggest is, I agree entirely with your comments about being prudent and acting on energy policy and decarbonizing, but there are much, much better justifications for that action than invoking extreme events. For a group, people who want action on climate, to invoke the importance of science and then very quickly leave that behind and say, this latest disaster, that, and so on, they undermine their own efforts to advocate for action because it's just not supportable.
And I am the child of two mathematicians and scientists. I believe in following evidence and data. On the global warming alarmists, anyone who actually points to the evidence that disproves their apocalyptical claims, they don't engage in reasoned debate. What do? They scream, "You're a denier." They brand you a heretic. It is, today the global warming alarmists are the equivalent of the flat earthers.
Part of what's unique about climate change, though, is the nature of some of the opposition to action. It's pretty rare that you'll encounter somebody who says the problem you're trying to solve simply doesn't exist. When President Kennedy set us on a course for the moon, there were a number of people who made a serious case that it wouldn't be worth it. It was going to be too expensive, it was going to be too hard, it would take too long. But nobody ignored the science. I don't remember anybody saying that the moon wasn't there or that it was made of cheese. Today's Congress, though, is full of folks who stubbornly and automatically reject the scientific evidence about climate change. They will tell you it is a hoax. There was one member of Congress who mentioned a theory involving dinosaur flatulence, which I won't get into, but now their view may be wrong and a fairly serious threat to everybody's future, but at least they have the brass to say what they actually think. There's some who also duck the question. They say, when they're asked about climate change, they say, hey, look, I'm not a scientist. And I'll translate that for you. What that really means is, I know that man-made climate change really is happening, but if I admit it, I'll be run out of town by a radical fringe that thinks climate science is a liberal plot, so I'm not going to admit it.
Over 90% of the scientists who deal with climate are absolutely convinced that the human activity, the industrial activity, the generation of CO2, methane, oxides of nitrogen, all the rest of those greenhouse gases are building up in the atmosphere, they're heat trapping, and they're causing not just warm drought in California, but severe storms and cold in the East Coast. Right. So it's climate disruption of many
I also want to
kinds.
say, since we're talking about most scientists, I've heard 97%, 98%. There's a recent paper by John Cook and co-authors who looked at thousands of research papers which have been published in the scientific literature to see what fraction, support the scientific consensus on global warming. Well, it turns out that the 97% consensus that they found, I am indeed part of, and Senator Sessions mentioned he would agree with it too. And my associate, John Christie, he agrees with it. In fact, all skeptics that I know of that work in this business all are part of that 97% because the 97% includes people who think humans have some influence on climate. That's a fairly innocuous statement. And that's something that continually annoys me is those of us that are called deniers. It's never actually, I think the D word was actually used by the chairman today. It's never actually been pointed out. What is it that we deny? Also, you know, this 97%. Well, what does the 97% consensus mean? You know, what do all of those people agree to? Well, they agree to something fairly innocuous, and it's something that most of us agree to, that humans must have some influence on climate. The question is how much? And how much influence makes all the difference in the world if you're going to be basing policy decisions, carbon taxes, regulations, legislation, whatever, on them. It makes all the difference in the world exactly how much warming we can expect due to human activities.
Okay, let's talk about having humility. I read this morning a Newsweek article from the 1970s talking about global cooling. And it said the science is clear, it is overwhelming, we are in a major cooling period, and it's going to cause enormous problems worldwide. And the solution for all the advocates in the 70s of global cooling was massive government control of the energy sector, of our economy, and aspects of our lives. Now, the data proved to be not backing up that theory. So then all the advocates of global cooling suddenly shifted to global warming. And they advocated it's warming, and the solution, interestingly enough, was the exact same solution, government control of the energy sector and every aspect of our lives. But then the data don't back that up. So if you notice, the term has shifted. And now suddenly it's climate change. And climate change, and again, the solution is government control of the energy sector and every aspect of our lives. And when someone keeps proposing the same solution regardless of the problem, you start to think maybe they just like government control of the energy sector and every aspect of our lives. And you ask, well, why shouldn't we do everything? You know, we shouldn't be causing millions of hardworking men and women to have their energy bills go through the roof. It causes real harm and suffering when people all across this country lose jobs because the federal government wants to take control of aspects of our lives. It causes real suffering when when single moms who are trying to feed their kids see their energy bills skyrocket because politicians are imposing massive costs, and that's not something we should do like.
Epidemics, poverty, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, all challenges that know no borders. The reality is that climate change ranks right up there with every single one of them. And it is a challenge that I address in nearly every single country that I visit as Secretary of State. Because President Obama and I believe it is urgent that we do so.
And as we've seen this morning, because the issue is so deeply politicized, there's a few points to make so that my testimony is not misconstrued. First, humans do influence the climate system in profound ways, including through the emission of carbon dioxide from the combustion of fossil fuels. And I would point you to the first working group report from the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for discussion of that. It is true that researchers have detected, and in some cases attributed, a human influence in measures of climate extremes that go beyond those few that I just mentioned, specifically surface temperatures and precipitation trends. The inability to detect and attribute changes in hurricanes, floods, tornadoes, and drought does not mean that human-caused climate change is not real or of concern. It does mean, however, that some activists, politicians, journalists, corporate and government agency representatives, and even scientists who should know better have made claims that are just unsupportable based on evidence and research. It's my view that such false claims undermine the credibility of arguments for action on climate change, and to the extent that these false claims confuse those who are making decisions related to extreme events, they could, in fact, lead to poor decision-making. Let me conclude by emphasizing that what I've reported to you today is consistent with what's been reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And in my written testimony, I've included direct quotes from that. This is mainstream science. It shouldn't be controversial, supported by peer-reviewed research, and I hope that it's of some use. Thank you very much.
But the debate is settled. Climate change is a fact. And
Now, those previous warm periods couldn't have been our fault. The point is, climate varies naturally. I know the title of today's hearing is something like climate change, it's happening today, or something like that. Well, yeah, and it's always changed. The question is, so what? How much of that change is due to humans?
We also know that in a world that's getting warmer than it used to be, all weather events are affected by it. More extreme droughts, floods, wildfires, and hurricanes. Those who already feel the effects of a changing climate don't have time to deny it. They're busy dealing with it. The firefighters who brave longer wildfire seasons, the farmers who see crops wilted one year and washed away the next, Western families worried about water that's drying up. The costs of these events can be measured in lost lives and livelihoods, lost homes and businesses, and hundreds of billions of dollars in emergency services and disaster relief.
The reality is that with respect to heat waves, as we heard earlier, and what's been called extreme precipitation, which is a scientific term and often isn't what most people would think of as extreme precipitation, yes, there has been a documented increase in those phenomena, and there have been attribution studies that link it to increasing greenhouse gases. But when it comes to the most costly, invisible disasters, hurricanes, floods, drought, and tornadoes, as I discussed, there is not presently attribution or even detection of increasing trends with respect to those phenomena. There may be in the future, but there's not presently.